Okay, welcome back to members of 121 Community Church in Grapevine, Texas, and our ongoing study in the Gospel of Mark. We're going to look at chapter 1 through 4. Let's go to block 1 and look at the text. The beginning of the good news about Jesus the Messiah, the Son of God. As it is written in Isaiah the prophet, I will send my messenger ahead of you who will prepare your way. A voice of one calling in the wilderness, prepare the way for the Lord, make straight paths for him. And so John the Baptist appeared in the wilderness, preaching a baptism of repentance for the forgiveness of sins. Let's go on to the commentary now in block 2, and we're going to look at all three of the commentaries, okay? We're going to look at all three. That's going to be our methodology. Let's go to block 2. Okay, first, let's look at MacArthur. Mark's gospel was intended for a Gentile audience, a Roman audience. He begins with a description of John the Baptist as the forerunner of the Messiah. Jesus is Greek for the Hebrew Joshua, meaning the Lord is salvation. We must understand John's baptism is a one-time act symbolizing the need to come to God. Now let's take a look at Ruckman. The intent of the gospel is to identify Jesus as the Son of God. Mark is telling us the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ. The gospel begins here and ends in the revelation to Paul, 1 Corinthians 15:14. I think that's very interesting. You know, Ruckman, like I said, he's a very conservative, but what an interesting idea here that the gospel begins here, but it ends with the revelation to Paul. Now, in our life group, we have studied the theological gospel of Paul. We have studied Galatians. We have also studied the theological gospel of John. And now we're looking at Mark. And I would say that both apostolic revelations in Ephesus fulfilled the revelatory truth of the gospel. I would say both John and Paul. So I would say, okay, the gospel begins here, but it ends with the revelation to Paul and to John both, I would say. Because the theological gospel of John is very, very mature, very, very powerful. And we already know the theological gospel of Paul in Galatians is very powerful. So I would say that it ends with the revelation to Paul and to the Apostle John. And we have studied both Galatians and John in our life group. And so I like what Ruckman's saying there, because I do see a very mature theological gospel in Paul, but also in John. And both did minister in Ephesus, so I think that final revelatory truth did come to the both apostles ministering in Ephesus, and that would be Paul and John, not only Paul. And we've studied both Galatians and John in our life group. Let's go on to Edwards. Mark uses arche, beginning, as a term of principle. It represents the whole gospel. The authority behind the gospel is God himself, and it is a report of victory. It is a report of victory. Mark inaugurates a new literary genre to the life and the ministry of Christ. The quotation is actually a tapestry of 3 Old Testament passages combined together in this quotation. Mark depicts John as the fulfillment of Elijah's climactic role. Like Elijah in 1 Kings 17:23, John is identified with the wilderness. So John is Elijah. He is Elijah the forerunner. He is one like unto Elijah. Let's go on to block 3 now, and we're going to take a look at the original Greek, some important aspects of the original Greek. Okay. Verse 1, arche tu euangeliou, translates the beginning of the gospel. From the beginning in a temporal sense. From archo, to reign or to rule. This is the gospel that shall reign in the realm of God's kingdom. Verse 2. Idou apostello ton angelon mu. Behold, I send my messenger. Behold, I send my angelon messenger, my messenger. Has kata ske qsi ten hadan su, who will prepare your way. And it means to prepare in an exact, precise way. To prepare in a way according to the sovereignty of God. Verse 3, Poiete atheas tas tribus autu. Make straight the paths, meaning without delay, immediately, and it means make the beaten way. That's the way it translates. Now, verse 4, very interesting. Kerusan baptisma metanoias, proclaiming the baptism of repentance. John proclaimed the baptism of repentance. And we've discussed this word before, but it's important to understand this word. Metanoia is change of mind, change of the inner self. And we've discussed this before because Jerome, when he was translating the Latin Vulgate for the Catholic Church, he mistranslated metanoia as do penance. And Martin Luther discovered this, and that was part of the reasoning behind the Reformation. Martin Luther realized that Jerome had mistranslated metanoia. It does not translate do penance. It translates repentance, change of mind, change of the inner self. John came proclaiming a baptism of repentance. Participate in a change of the inner self. Turn away from your old self and turn toward God. Repentance is turning away from the old self and turning toward the Messiah. That's what John came to proclaim. And he symbolized that through baptism, but turn from the old self, die to the old self, and turn toward the Messiah. You die in that being submerged into the River Jordan, and then as you are raised up out of the River Jordan, you turn toward the Messiah. A baptism of repentance. We have discussed that before, but I think it's important that we find it in the original Greek here that the word used is metanoia. And metanoia in the Greek literally translates change of mind, change of the inner self. Turn from the old self and turn toward Christ. And repentance is ongoing. For those of us who are believers, you practice that every day, every hour. You crucify the old self continually, and you turn and meditate on Christ continually. Metanoia is ongoing for the believer. We continually die to the old self. We continually turn through prayer and meditation. We meditate all day on Christ. We meditate all day on Christ. Throughout every aspect of our day, we're meditating on Christ. And that is what Paul called unceasing prayer. It's meditation, unceasing prayer. And we practice as believers, as disciples of Christ, unceasing prayer. That's what we do. We practice metanoia, dying to the old self and turning toward Christ. So very powerful Greek there in verse 4. John the Baptist came proclaiming the baptism of metanoia. the baptism of repentance. Very, very powerful, extremely powerful. And I'm going to read the text again now that we've looked at this. The beginning of the good news about Jesus the Messiah, the Son of God, as it is written in Isaiah the prophet, I will send my messenger ahead of you who will prepare your way. The voice of one calling in the wilderness, prepare the way for the Lord, make straight paths for him. And so, John the Baptist appeared in the wilderness, preaching a baptism of repentance for the forgiveness of sins. Forgiveness comes through dying to the old self and turning toward Christ. Forgiveness comes to us through dying to the old self and turning away from the old self and turning toward Christ, Son of God, Christ, Messiah. That's what we get from the text here. And I want to go back to Ruckman because that's an interesting statement in Ruckman. And I want to think about that again just for a second here. Okay, go to Block 2, Note 2C. The gospel begins here and ends with the revelation to Paul. That's very interesting. You know, Ruckman is a very, very conservative theologian. Very conservative theologian. And what an interesting idea that in Mark we have the beginning of the revelation of the gospel, but that the full theological revelation came through Paul, and I would add through John. Galatians is the theological gospel of Paul. John is the theological gospel of the Apostle John. Now, the Apostle John came very late at the end of the first century, the very, very end of the first century. The Gospel of John closes out the apostolic period. It is very, very late. Galatians is AD 50, AD 51. Just call it AD 50. Galatians is dated at the same time as the Jerusalem Council. Mark is AD 64, so you had Galatians, the theological gospel of Paul, AD 50, and then 14 years later you had the gospel of Mark, and then all the way to AD 95, you have the Gospel of John. So it's the Gospel of John is very, very late first century. We've been blessed to be able to study all three, well, two of those. We've studied Galatians already. We've studied Gospel of John, and now we're looking at Mark. But I really like, from Ruckman, I really like that statement. I never thought about that before, but there has been the revelation to Paul was a tremendous revelation. And it was not just on the road to Damascus. It was on the road to Damascus, and then it was 3 years in Arabia of prayer and meditation. That revelation came over quite a long period of time. And then Paul studied again. He went back to Jerusalem. He interviewed the Apostle Peter. He interviewed James the Just. So that revelation to Paul, it was over a number of years. But Galatians is the theological gospel of Paul. It's very, very powerful. That's going to get us started. That's 1 through 4. And next time, we're going to pick up in the text and go to 1, 5 through 8. So that wraps up 1 through 4.